encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Welcome to Wifey Wednesdays, a podcast for women who are seeking to be the best wives they can be. I'm your host, Emily Hatfield, and this is the show where the plan is always to do things God's way, especially our marriages. Now, if you are joining us for the spiritual disciplines season, I am so excited that you're here. If you are new to the podcast because of that, welcome. You're among friends here. If you're watching the video version of this podcast, then welcome to Disciplined Emily. I'm even wearing my workout clothes, so you're welcome. But today's episode is not going to be about exercise, though. Ooh, yikes. We'll get to that. Today's episode is actually going to start by diving into the discipline of Bible reading. Ultimately, if you're wanting to grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ, if you're wanting to become more like him, well, then you have to know what he's like. And how are you going to know that unless you read? If you want to do what he expects, you have to know what that is. In Luke 14, Jesus tells us about what it takes to be a disciple. Disciples have to count the cost of discipleship. You and I have to choose if we are willing to follow Jesus at any cost. Are we willing to love God most? Are we willing to forsake other pursuits? Are we willing to bear a cross and follow him, regardless of where the path goes? But see, how am I going to know any of those things without Bible intake? How am I going to know the cost of discipleship if I don't read? God doesn't choose to speak to us in the same way that he's spoken to others in the past. He isn't coming to us in a bush like he did Moses. He isn't speaking from a loud voice in a cloud, showing up in a temple on top of an ark. He's not using donkeys to say words to people, which I'm thankful for because I feel like I would pass out. But he is still speaking. And by God's immeasurable grace, you and I live in a time where we get to have all of God's words. Now think about that for a minute. There are so many times when we think, I wish that I had been on Mount Sinai. I wish I could have heard God, seen the glory. It would have been cool to see a donkey talk. It would have been cool to be, having these visions. It would have been, all of those things, yes, are amazing. But what's more amazing is that we have the entire will of God revealed to us. We're not waiting on something else. But unfortunately, we don't often give it that much respect. Too often, I let my Bible sit idly between Sundays and Wednesdays, picking it up only when I take it with me to worship or Bible class. I don't allow God to speak to me through the week, and then I wonder, why am I struggling so much with anxiety and restlessness, and crippling worry, overwhelming dread and despair? But the more I read, the more I take in his words and hide them in my heart, the more I am able to have his words comfort me, even when I'm not reading. When I'm in the midst of a trying time, I don't have to have my physical copy of God's word necessarily, because I have comforting verses deep inside my heart that can always be brought to the forefront of my mind at a moment's notice. But it hasn't always been that way. I was well into my walk with Jesus before I'd even read all of his words. So if you're listening to this podcast today and you haven't read through the entire Bible, please don't be discouraged. It is a huge undertaking and it is a large, albeit holy task. But please do be encouraged to start. I'm not saying read the Bible in a year. unless that kind of goal-oriented thing helps to keep you motivated. It does me. I like reading through the Bible in a year. But maybe you read through the Bible in 2 years or 3 years. Maybe this year you try to make it through the first 5 books of the Old Testament or the entire New Testament. Having a foundation of all of God's Word is helpful. And if you haven't made it to that point yet, I would highly recommend trying. Even if it takes you years to complete, it will be a fruitful adventure. The emphasis on Bible intake is less on how much and more on how deep. How deep do you let God's Word penetrate your heart? You can be a read the Bible in a year person all day, every day, and never let those words penetrate your heart and change your life. Ultimately, then, it's become a Pharisaical checklist instead of a transformative journey into looking more like Jesus. Instead, the purpose of disciplining ourselves to read God's words is to take whatever chunk you can and hide it in your heart. If you're reading 3 verses or 3 chapters, that part isn't the focus. The focus is, am I letting His words change my life? Am I letting His words shape my mind? Romans 12:2 says that what is good and acceptable to God is that our minds are renewed, transformed from the carnal into the spiritual so that we can discern His will. If you're reading to check a box, you're likely not being transformed. But if a box being checked helps you and encourages you to stay in the Word, then check all the boxes. But do yourself a favor and do it in digestible chunks. For example, I can read a chapter of the Bible and start discerning it. Sometimes I can read an entire epistle and do that. But recently, I was reading through a chapter of Romans with my daughter and I realized, you know what? She can't do even 1 chapter at a time. She's not ready. Now, did I fault her for that? Absolutely not. She's 7. We're all in different places in our walk with Jesus. And you know what? I go through different seasons and valleys and mountains in my own walk. Sometimes I'm in a place where I can read 3 chapters a day. And sometimes I'm in a place where I need to slow down and take 3 verses at a time to more deeply appreciate them. Sometimes I need the fire hose of God's Word to overwhelm my anxious mind. And sometimes I need the tender pleadings of a couple of verses to hide in my mind and meditate on the rest of the day. The point of this discipline journey is not to tell you how to read the Bible in a year, or how to read or how to study. It's to train yourself to study, to read, to invest in God's words, knowing that they are life. Here are just some random pieces of advice, though. Take them or leave them. They're just my 2 cents. But if you are reading through the Bible in larger chunks, don't let that be all. I love reading through the entire Bible story because it helps me pick up on nuances and things that I haven't necessarily seen before. It helps me make connections. And for me personally, it helps me to see the scarlet thread of redemption a little more clearly. However, only reading in big chunks doesn't always help me to apply those truths in my life. That's why on my daily discipline planner, I've got a section marked for all the things I'm reading, but also on an area of meditation. I need a small, manageable chunk of God's Word that I can rehearse over and over again. But I also like the freedom of reading many chapters or an entire book. Last week, one day I had 1 chapter written on my to-read section. And on another day, I had an entire epistle. There is so much freedom in how we approach God's Word. The important thing is approach Him. We serve an amazing, holy, remarkable God who has allowed us to approach Him and to know Him and to know His story. He has invited us into His heart and into His mind. And as someone who loves Him and desires a relationship with Him, I want Him to see that I'm invested in our relationship, that I'm invested in Him. I want to pore over his words, not just to tell him, yeah, I read this, but to really listen to what he has to say about himself. The reason I want to discipline myself to become more of a reader is because I want to discipline myself to become more of a seeker. I want to be a treasure hunter. And a true treasure is the heart of God. I want to find it, see it, study it. I want to be overwhelmed by the beauty so that one day, when I get to see my treasure face to face, I will be able to fall down in worship and full surrender to him. Matthew 6:21 says, "Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Where do you want your heart? I want my heart in the hands of Jesus. So I'm going to seek him every day. Some days it's chaotic. Some days it's hard to have him in it. This morning I was trying to read and my children were dancing around, asking me questions and interrupting. And you know what? It forced me to read and reread a few verses, and that's okay. Bible reading doesn't have to be alone in a quiet space. God invites us into his heart, even in the midst of our own chaos, perhaps especially in the midst of our chaos. Is it more important that I find a secluded and perfectly cozy spot, or that I find him? Is it more important that I be shut off from the rest of the world, or that my children see me poring over the God I love? It takes discipline to be a daily Bible student. It takes discipline to be a seeker of God. But just because something is hard doesn't mean it's insurmountable. Chances are it actually means that it's a worthy endeavor. And is there anything more worthy of an endeavor than seeking God's will? In Philippians 3, Paul says, "Whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Jesus Christ, my Lord." There is so much worth in knowing Jesus. Train yourself to seek him. Train yourself to know him more. If you seek, you will find. If you knock, he will answer. I have prayed and will keep praying that this will be a beneficial season for all of us. There is no more worthy a goal than to come to know God more fully. It's what I'm training myself to do this season, and I'm grateful that you're joining me on this journey. Thank you for listening. I invite you back next week as we discuss disciplining ourselves to pray. Every week there is something for me to take note of, to grow in, but any progress is progress. Because again, we're treasure hunters, we're seekers, we're seeking God's heart. Any closer we get to him, it's a beautiful thing. I hope you'll join me, keep joining me on this journey of spiritual disciplines, not for us, not for ourselves, not to say that we're something or we've achieved something. The whole point of this entire journey is to know God more and to love and appreciate him more. To him belongs all glory, honor, and effort. I'm so thankful that he gives us these moments together that we can talk about him. Until next time, remember, love God.